arguably we should have acted 10 years ago, right, or 20 years ago. So we have absolutely no time to waste.
You can realize that when something's that complicated, that means that there's something for everybody to do.
We don't have a choice to stop what's happening, we have a choice to slow it down.
My name is Sonali McDermott, and I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies at New York University.
I'm Andy Revkin, write a column for the New York Times online, otherwise called a blog, called .earth.
My name is Gavin Schmidt. I'm a climate scientist and director of the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies. So think about how hard it would be to drive if a car acted in the same way that the climate system does, right? You know, you'd see a stop sign coming up and you'd take your foot off the accelerator, but instead of the car slowing down, you're continuing to speed up. And in fact, by the time you get to the stop, you're actually going faster than when you first saw the stop sign, right? It makes it almost impossible to drive a car unless you know exactly what's going to happen, you know, blocks and blocks down the road. And that's where we are with the climate system. Like, we know what's kind of going to happen, but the actions that we take, we still have our foot on the accelerator and we don't have a brake pedal. And we're trying to drive a system and we're trying not to crash. But it's really stacked against us. People talk about what's going to happen often in terms of degrees Celsius, you know, 3 degrees, 4 degrees, 5 degrees Celsius warmer. But quite frankly, people don't really understand what that means. You know, temperatures in this room fluctuate, you know, by a couple of degrees since we're sitting here, you know, giving off our own heat. And, you know, the temperature here has gone up by a couple of degrees and none of you have gone extinct and the tables have not melted. So why is it different for the real world? Well, the real world has a different scale, and so it's important to remember what that scale is. We're in Manhattan right now. We're on the 15th floor. And 20,000 years ago, where we are exactly, we'd still be under hundreds of meters of ice, right? So the ice sheet on Manhattan would have been higher than we are now, right? And that ice sheet was part of an ice sheet that covered almost all of Canada and everywhere north of here, really. And it finished in Brooklyn. So if any of you have been to Prospect Park and you're looking down Prospect Park and kind of halfway down there's some little hilly bits, that's the terminal moraine of the last glacial maximum ice sheet. And that was 20,000 years ago, right? So 20,000 years ago, where we were now was in the middle of the ice, right? Even if we're on the 15th floor here. And that went for, you know, another 10 miles south and you know, 1,000 miles north. And I mention that because the temperature of the whole planet during that period, that was a totally different planet that had, you know, huge amounts of water in the ice. There was, you know, sea level was 400 feet lower than it was now because of all that water that was in the ice. The global mean temperature was only about 5 degrees colder than today, right? So think of that as an ice age unit, right? The difference between today and an ice age is 5 degrees. Where we're going to be in 2100, given no efforts to reduce emissions, is about 5 degrees, is about 1 ice age unit. So we would be in 2100, you know, as far away from today as we are from the ice age. And that's going to be a completely different planet. You know, it's a planet with different ecosystem zones. It's a planet with different sea level. It's a planet with different crops and infrastructure needs, and everything is going to be different. And I don't know exactly how different that's going to be. But that's the scale that we're talking about. We're not talking about a small perturbation on what we've got now. We're talking about a completely different situation. And our concern about that is not because we know exactly what's going to happen. It's because we don't know exactly what's going to happen. And yet we are kicking the system in ways that previously only geology has kicked that system. And now we are active geological participants. And that scares me. I think the biggest misconception is how people think about risk. What we're talking about here is not a perfect scientific prediction that we want to avoid, but we have a risk of bad things happening, and we have to be managing risk. That means that we take into account the uncertainties. That means we take into account what we don't know and the potential for unknown unknowns, but we still make plans that we hope are going to give us the least worst outcome and hopefully even a good outcome in the future. And I think the biggest misconception that people have is not by thinking about this as a risk management problem, but thinking about this as pollution and clean up the pollution problem.
I think it's severely urgent but non-apparent, meaning that it's urgent depending upon what it is that we value, right? If we decide that sea level rise is not a big deal and we can afford to lose a good portion of our coastal cities, and that trade-off is okay, then it's not that urgent, right? If we decide, however, that that's not acceptable, and you would think that that's a very dramatic example, but for instance, there are species that we probably have never heard of before, species of insects that we would never see, that would never bother us, that we're losing on a daily basis, and we have to ask ourselves, are we really seeing the impacts of that? Now, ecosystems and environmental impacts usually have a lag time, which means that we don't feel the full impact until many years later, and that's something that I don't think we're considering very well. I think that if we want to preserve the world, at least as it is right now, we need to act right away. In fact, arguably we should have acted 10 years ago, right, or 20 years ago, so we have absolutely no time to waste. I think that if we're in a position to make decisions about what it is we do and do not value, and this is what I mean, we have to decide what kind of world that we want. India might decide that having a bit warmer temperatures and a much more variable monsoon might be an okay trade-off to get everybody electricity, right? These are the types of decisions that are going through people's heads, in which case it's not as urgent as 10 years ago. It might be as urgent as the next 5 years, right, to actually do something. But it definitely stands that the longer we take to do anything, the more expensive it's going to be. So again, that's a trade-off that we have to make. And I think Andy put it very well. It's a sliding scale towards misery, right? So at what point in that scale we want to stop is our decision. But everything is urgent. And then again, it isn't, depending upon what we value. Agriculture at this point, when you combine it with land use change, meaning deforestation for agricultural purposes, and the bulk of deforestation is usually done for pasture or soybean or some sort of agricultural reasons. When you combine land use with agriculture, you're looking at about 30% of global emissions. The thing about agriculture that makes it much harder than some of these fossil fuel industries themselves is that the fossil fuel industries tend to be much more regarded as point sources, right? Like there's certain places at which those emissions are occurring, aside from transport, right? That can be pinned down a bit better than agriculture. Agriculture tends to be, by definition, much more heterogeneous, much more widespread, right? And so it's hard to pin down the emissions coming from this particular field, right? Or this, and therefore it's hard to stress some uniform management option the way that you can to coal-fired plants, right? In the most extreme case, shut them down. In the less extreme case, carbon capture and storage and that sort of thing. It's harder to do that with agriculture, but you are looking at about 30% of emissions, right, from agriculture. And if we think that we're going to target the whole problem by just reducing coal, and not looking at the other components and not looking at agriculture, we're kind of fooling ourselves, right? Turning the tap down on your faucet is not the same thing as turning it off. If you eliminate coal, you're still going to have emissions. And really what we care about are not emissions, but concentrations in the atmosphere, right? Think about the water filling up in your basin, right? In your washtub basin. If you turn the water down, it's still filling up. the focus should be less on the denialism, and there's been a lot of study to show that denialism is potentially very manufactured, right? There was actually a great book that came out by Naomi Oreskes called The Merchants of Doubt, right? And it has been made into a movie where she looks at basically how embedded manufacturing denialism has been, right, ever since. I mean, and she actually takes it back not just to the tobacco industry, but also fire retardants and mattresses, and sort of how this has been architectured over time. So the denialist front I find to be quite specific, and something that, in my opinion, is important, but I think that we need not waste our time on trying to solve denialism, right? So I think what needs to happen is, and in this country specifically, because of what we've developed, what we've accomplished, sort of how unique our upbringing has been, compared to, much older societies and other societies. It's a very unique and wonderful kind of development. So I think where the focus needs to be is not so much educating people about climate change, because again, you can talk until you're blue in the face, and I don't think the data makes a difference to people, but educating them about how investing in renewables, investing in alternatives, perhaps consuming less, need not be equated with some limiting, stifling lifestyle, that we can have really fulfilling lives, and we can have objects. If you do want that kind of, object-oriented lifestyle, you can have that as well too. I'm not saying you can have it all. You might have less, but we can have higher quality lives that involve owning a little bit less. And there are multiple ways of going about doing that, for everything from investing in alternatives and creating jobs and fostering creativity and development in that field, to even just investing in products that you don't throw away, right? Products that are high quality and good and make you feel like it's luxurious, but that are crafted well, and things that you don't waste, right? And I think that's true everything from your clothes to your furniture to your food to your cars to everything along those lines. So I think that's where the education component needs to be, not so much in trying to get people to realize climate change is real.
I've written about climate change a lot in the context of human development generally. We've been in kind of Zoom mode for 200 years, becoming a global force through this, we call it the Anthropocene now. But we've only really had the science showing that that's the case, that we're having global impacts, some of which are long-lasting. Extinction rates are long-lasting. Climate change for a few decades. And in the history of the human species, a few decades is nothing. So it doesn't surprise me so much that it's taking time to realize that. And the analogy I've had for this is that we're sort of like, it's like that point in your life as a human being when you're poised to move from teenage kind of exuberance to adulthood, where you're thinking more about the future, you're putting some money aside for the future, you're not just a here and now person, you become more widespread and have empathy, and so it's kind of like coming of age. It's like coming of age as an individual. Now as a species, we're sort of going through that same process. And I wrote a piece in 2008 saying it's like puberty on the scale of a planet. It's like we're going through puberty. And the question we have before us, which is what I'll be talking about in the next course, is what do we want to be when we grow up? What does that look like? It's like moving from a sprint, being a sprinter, to being a marathon runner. Changing the pace to a pace that's a better fit for a long haul relationship with the planet and with ourselves. And reflecting on this climate problem and the human development challenge generally, it's so big that you could look at it as paralytic, and so complicated, so wicked, as Kelly Levin at World Resources Institute puts it. Or you can realize that when something is that complicated, that means that there's something for everybody to do. So whether you're an artist or an engineer or a teacher or an investor or an inventor, whatever role you have in society going forward, you can do something that can help modulate these trajectories in some small way or maybe in a big way. And that to me is very exciting. It means that no one's left out. There's something for everybody to do. It means that collaborative approaches are really vital. Sharing information, talking to everybody is really vital. Communication is really vital. There's lots to do. Getting busy is important. Staying energized is important too. And it's not a false sense of optimism. It's just that engagement is different than optimism. Getting engaged, building a life that incorporates some of these things is a great thing.